A man spends his entire life trying to prove his worth to a cold, distant father, only to sit in a mahogany-panelled office and learn his inheritance is a rotting, barnacle-infested boat. It sounds like a cruel joke. But that rusted hull hid a secret that would rewrite Thomas Gallagher's entire family history. The rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander Pendleton's downtown Boston law office felt entirely appropriate for the occasion. It was a bleak, miserable Tuesday, the kind of day that seeps into the bones and stays there. Thomas sat on a leather sofa that probably cost more than his annual salary as a high school history teacher, staring at his damp shoes. Directly across from him sat his stepmother, Evelyn, and his half-brother, Preston. Evelyn was dressed in impeccable black mourning attire, though her posture lacked any actual grief. She looked sharp, composed, and faintly bored, subtly adjusting a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the muted office light. Preston, 10 years Thomas's junior and already a junior vice president at their father's logistics firm, mirrored her indifference. He was busy checking his phone, occasionally sighing as if the reading of his father's last will and testament was a minor scheduling conflict. And then there was his father, Richard Gallagher, or rather his ghost, hovering heavily over the room in the form of a thick stack of legal documents resting on Alexander Pendleton's massive oak desk. Richard Gallagher was a man who measured human worth strictly by profit margins and ruthless ambition. He had built a shipping and logistics empire from the ground up, sacrificing everything, including his first wife, Thomas's mother, to the stress of his relentless climb. When she passed away, he married Evelyn less than a year later. From that moment on, Thomas became an outsider in his own family. He wasn't cutthroat enough. He didn't want a corner office. He wanted to teach. To his father, his choice of profession was an unforgivable weakness, a betrayal of the Gallagher name. Alexander Pendleton cleared his throat, a dry, papery sound that silenced the room. He adjusted his half-moon spectacles and broke the seal on the final folder. "Let us proceed," Alexander began, his voice devoid of emotion. "We will start with the liquid assets, the real estate portfolio, and the controlling shares of Gallagher Freight and Logistics." For the next 45 minutes, Thomas listened to a staggering inventory of wealth being methodically distributed. The sprawling estate in the Hamptons, Evelyn's. The penthouse overlooking Central Park, Preston's. The offshore accounts, the Cayman Trust, the 60% controlling stake in the billion-dollar logistics empire, all neatly divided between his stepmother and her golden child. Thomas didn't expect the money. He had made his peace years ago with the fact that his father's fortune would never be his. But a small, foolish part of him, the inner child that still craved a nod of approval from a man incapable of giving one, hoped for something. A token, a watch, a letter acknowledging that, despite their differences, he was still his son. Alexander turned to the final page. The room grew unnervingly quiet. Preston finally looked up from his phone, a cruel, knowing smirk playing on his lips. Evelyn simply stared out the window, refusing to even look in Thomas's direction. "And finally," Alexander read, his voice dropping half an octave, "to my eldest son, Thomas Gallagher." Thomas leaned forward involuntarily, his heart hammering a sudden erratic rhythm against his ribs. "I leave the sum total of my disappointment," Alexander read, quoting Richard's exact words. The lawyer swallowed hard, looking deeply uncomfortable for the first time. "And the title, deed, and physical possession of the marine vessel known as the Iron Albatross, currently moored at Slip 42 in Camden, Maine." Silence stretched across the room, heavy and suffocating. "A boat?" Thomas managed to say, the word scraping against his dry throat. "He left me a boat?" Preston let out a short, sharp laugh. "A boat is a generous term, Tommy. It's an 80-foot rusted shrimp trawler he bought at a police auction 30 years ago. The marina fees alone are probably more than you make in a decade." He used to joke that it was the only asset he owned that sank as fast as your career. Evelyn finally turned to Thomas, her eyes devoid of anything resembling warmth. "Your father always had a unique sense of humor, Thomas. Alexander, are we finished here? I have a board meeting at 2. "We are finished, Mrs. Gallagher," Alexander said softly. He slid a single manila envelope across the desk toward Thomas. "The title and the marina coordinates, Thomas. I am terribly sorry." Thomas stood up, ignoring Preston's laughter and Evelyn's retreating back. He picked up the envelope. It felt incredibly light. This was it. 34 years of seeking approval, ending in a punchline, delivered from beyond the grave. His father hadn't just cut him out of the will. He had deliberately gone out of his way to humiliate him, saddle him with a financial burden, and remind him of his exact worth in his eyes. He walked out of the law office and back into the Boston rain, the manila envelope clutched in his hand. He was furious. He was heartbroken. But beneath the anger, a tiny, nagging spark of curiosity ignited. His father was a man who calculated every single move he made. He didn't keep a rotting shrimp boat for 3 decades just for a posthumous joke. It didn't fit his profile. Richard was hiding something, and Thomas was going to find out what it was. The drive up the coast to Camden, Maine, took 4 hours, but Thomas's spiraling thoughts made it feel like a lifetime. The rain from Boston had followed him north, transforming into a thick, oppressive coastal fog that clung to the pine trees and muted the sounds of the ocean. When he pulled his beat-up Honda into the gravel parking lot of the marina, his heart sank. Preston hadn't been exaggerating. This wasn't a yacht club with gleaming white decks and men in pastel sweaters sipping mimosas. This was a working harbor. It smelled fiercely of decaying kelp, spilled diesel fuel, and raw fish. The docks were warped and splintering, lined with rugged commercial fishing vessels that looked like they had been through wars. He found the harbormaster in a small, slanted shack at the end of the main pier. His name was Elias Cobb, a man who looked like he was carved out of driftwood. He had a thick white beard, a weathered face, and eyes that had spent too many decades staring down Atlantic squalls. "Can I help you?" Elias asked, not looking up from a frayed rope he was meticulously splicing. "I'm looking for slip 42, Thomas said. "A boat called the Iron Albatross. I'm Richard Gallagher's son." Elias stopped what he was doing. He looked up, his pale blue eyes studying the younger man intently. Slowly, he set the rope down. "Gallagher's boy, huh? I heard the old man passed. Cancer?" "Heart failure," Thomas corrected, though he highly doubted his father actually had a heart to begin with. Elias let out a low whistle. "Can't say I'm surprised. Man was wound tighter than a winch cable. Come on, I'll take you to her." Thomas followed the harbormaster down the slick, wooden docks. The fog was so thick he couldn't see the end of the pier. "Did you know my father well?" Thomas asked, trying to keep pace with Elias's surprisingly brisk walk. "Nobody knew your father well, son," Elias replied over his shoulder. "He's paid the slip fees on time, every month, for 30 years. But he only came up here maybe twice a year, usually in the dead of winter." "Did he take the boat out? Go fishing?" Elias stopped walking and turned to Thomas, a bewildered look on his face. "Fishing? Richard Gallagher? Hell no. The engine on that rust bucket hasn't turned over since the Reagan administration. The hull is more barnacle than steel at this point." "Then what did he do?" Thomas asked, entirely baffled. "He'd just sit," Elias said quietly, pointing a thick, calloused finger into the fog. "He'd show up in a ratty old sweater. Never those fancy suits he wore on TV. Climb aboard, lock the cabin door, and stay in there for hours. Wouldn't talk to a soul, wouldn't let anyone on board to do maintenance, just sat in the dark. Then he'd leave." They stepped out of the fog, and Thomas's inheritance finally loomed into view. The Iron Albatross was an absolute monstrosity. It was a massive 80-foot commercial trawler that looked like a floating tetanus trap. The steel hull was streaked with deep, bleeding lines of orange rust. The deck was littered with decaying nets, shattered crab pots, and ropes that had stiffened into petrified coils. The paint, which might have once been a proud navy blue, was flaking off like a terrible skin disease. It looked less like a boat and more like a maritime graveyard. "She's all yours," Elias muttered, patting Thomas's shoulder sympathetically. "Don't step on the aft deck. The wood is rotted straight through. If you need a number for a scrap yard, let me know. They might give you a few grand for the scrap metal, though towing her there will cost you double that." "Thanks, Elias," Thomas murmured, staring up at the rusted behemoth. Once the harbour master was out of sight, Thomas took a deep breath of the briny air and grabbed the rusted railing. It shrieked in protest as he pulled himself onto the main deck. The boat shifted heavily in the water, groaning like a dying animal. The smell of decay was overpowering, stagnant water, mold and old oil. He carefully navigated the treacherous deck, avoiding gaping holes where the wood had surrendered to the sea, and made his way to the wheelhouse. The door was secured with a heavy, brass padlock. He fished the key Alexander Pendleton had given him out of his pocket. It slid in with difficulty, and after a few hard twists, the lock popped open. He pulled the heavy door open, stepping over the high threshold into the cabin. It was dark, cold, and claustrophobic. Thomas flicked his phone's flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the space. It was exactly what one would expect from an abandoned trawler. A dilapidated captain's chair with its stuffing spilling out, a cracked wooden wheel, and a navigation console covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. To the left was a small galley with a rusted-out stove. To the right, a set of narrow stairs leading down into the hull's sleeping quarters. He spent an hour tearing the cabin apart. He opened every drawer, checked under the rotted mattresses, and sifted through decades-old navigation charts that crumbled like dead leaves in his hands. He found empty thermoses, a pair of cracked binoculars, and a few old maritime magazines. Nothing else. No secret wills, no hidden stash of cash, no letter of apology. Defeated, Thomas collapsed into the ruined captain's chair. A cloud of dust puffed up around him. He buried his face in his hands. Preston was right. It was just a joke. His father had spent 30 years paying slip fees on a piece of garbage just so he could use it as a final, cruel punchline against the son he despised. He was ready to leave. He was ready to walk down the dock, call the scrapyard Elias had mentioned, and wash his hands of the Gallagher name forever. But as he stood up, his boot caught the edge of a heavy metal floor grate, sending him stumbling forward. He slammed shoulder first into the wood-paneled bulkhead behind the captain's chair. The sound wasn't right. Instead of a solid, dull thud, the wall echoed. It was a hollow, resonant sound. He frowned, rubbing his bruised shoulder. He stepped back and looked at the bulkhead. Then he looked at the ceiling, tracing the line of the wall. He turned around and looked out the portside window, judging the distance from the wheelhouse door to the back of the cabin. His heart began to race. He had grown up measuring houses, building sets for the school theatre, calculating square footage. His brain automatically processed dimensions. The exterior of the wheelhouse structure was at least 20 feet long, but the interior room he was standing in, it was barely 12 feet deep. There was an 8-foot discrepancy, a massive, unaccounted-for gap between the back wall of this cabin and the exterior steel hull of the boat. He rushed over to the wood-paneled bulkhead. He ran his hands frantically over the grimy mahogany surface, pressing, pushing, searching for a seam. The wood was solid, tightly fitted, and securely nailed down. There were no handles, no hinges, no obvious mechanisms. Thomas ran down to the rusted galley and grabbed a heavy iron pry bar that had been left near the stove. He sprinted back up, wedged the sharp end of the iron bar into the tight seam where the wall met the floorboards, and threw all his weight into it. The wood groaned. Old nails squealed in protest. He pulled harder, sweat stinging his eyes despite the freezing temperature of the cabin. With a loud, violently echoing crack, a large vertical panel of mahogany splintered and tore away from the frame. A rush of cold, incredibly stale, chemically treated air hit his face. It didn't smell like mold or sea salt. It smelled like machine oil and old paper. He shone his phone flashlight into the gaping hole he had just created. Behind the false wall was a small, perfectly preserved, hermetically sealed compartment. It was lined with pristine, modern stainless steel, a stark, shocking contrast to the rotting wood and rust everywhere else on the boat. And resting in the center of this hidden steel vault, illuminated by the harsh white beam of his phone, was a heavy military-grade titanium lockbox. Next to it sat a thick, leather-bound ledger, untouched by time, moisture, or decay. Thomas's breath hitched in his throat. His father hadn't come here to sit in the dark and do nothing. He had come here to guard something that was worth more to him than his mansions, his company, and his reputation combined. He reached his hand through the shattered wood and grabbed the handle of the titanium box. It was heavy. Too heavy to be just documents. As he dragged it out into the dim light of the ruined cabin, he realized the cruel joke his father had played on him wasn't a joke at all. It was a test, and he had just passed the first question. Thomas dragged the heavy titanium lockbox out of the secret compartment and onto the dust-covered floorboards of the wheelhouse. His hands were shaking. The box was secured with a heavy-duty, 4-digit mechanical combination lock. Titanium didn't yield to pry bars, and he highly doubted Elias the harbour master kept an angle grinder in his shack. If he wanted to see what was inside, he had to crack it the old-fashioned way. He sat cross-legged on the ruined floor, staring at the brass dials. What numbers would a man like Richard Gallagher use? Thomas tried his father's birth year, 1948. Nothing. He tried Preston's birthday, August 12th. The latch didn't budge. He tried the date of his father's marriage to Evelyn, the anniversary of the founding of Gallagher Freight and Logistics, and even the 4 digits of Richard's childhood home in South Boston. Nothing worked. Frustrated, he leaned back against the mahogany paneling. The cold air from the hidden compartment chilled the sweat on his neck. He thought about his father. He thought about the way he operated, ruthless, guarded, and entirely driven by his own twisted sense of legacy. But this boat wasn't about his corporate conquests. It was hidden. It was dirty. It was tied to a past he wanted buried. His chest tightened as a dark thought crossed his mind. His mother. She had died on a rainy Tuesday in November. He leaned forward, his fingers trembling as he spun the cold brass dials. 1104. November 4th. The heavy internal mechanism gave a loud, satisfying click. The breath rushed out of his lungs. He unlatched the heavy clasps and pushed the lid open. Inside, shielded by layers of waterproofed canvas and desiccant packets, was a stack of documents that smelled faintly of old parchment and cedar. He carefully lifted the top layer. It was a thick stack of elaborate, heavy stock certificates with ornate scrollwork around the edges. He recognized the crest immediately. They were Union Bank of Switzerland, UBS bearer bonds, dated from the late 1980s. Each one was denominated in increments of $100,000. He quickly counted the stack. There were over 50 of them. That was $5 million in untraceable, liquid assets, sitting right in his lap. But it wasn't the money that made his blood run cold. It was what sat beneath the bonds. It was a thick, black leather ledger, the spine cracked and worn from use. He opened it to the first page. It was filled with his father's unmistakable sharp handwriting, tight, aggressive, leaning heavily to the right. He began to read. Hours bled away. The fog outside the wheelhouse deepened into a dark, impenetrable Maine night. But he couldn't stop reading. By the glow of his phone's flashlight, he watched his father's empire unravel in ink. The narrative Richard had spun for the press, for Wall Street, and for his own family was a complete fabrication. He hadn't built Gallagher Freight from the ground up through grit and savvy investments. He had stolen it. According to the meticulously kept ledger, the seed money, the original fleet of trucks, and the crucial warehouse real estate in South Boston hadn't belonged to Richard at all. They belonged to Thomas's maternal grandfather, a quiet, hard-working man named Alexander Callahan, who owned a mid-sized regional transport company. When his grandfather died in 1984, Thomas's mother was the sole heir to the Callahan estate. Richard, who was the grandfather's aggressive young accountant at the time, manipulated Thomas's grieving mother into signing over broad power of attorney. Over the next 3 years, Richard methodically siphoned the Callahan assets into dummy corporations he set up in Delaware. He used an obscure, now defunct division of the First National Bank of Boston to launder the operational capital, bankrupting his mother's legacy on paper while secretly absorbing it into his newly minted entity, Gallagher Freight. He hadn't just neglected Thomas's mother, he had systematically robbed her, broken her spirit, and built his billionaire status on the ashes of her family's hard work. The ledger detailed every illegal transfer, every bribed dock inspector, and every forged signature. The bearer bonds were his emergency parachute. The original, unlaundered cash reserves he had bled from the Callahan accounts, hidden away outside the jurisdiction of the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. His father didn't keep this boat as a twisted joke. The Iron Albatross was his vault. He couldn't keep the ledger in a bank deposit box. A court order or an IRS audit could seize it. He couldn't keep it at the penthouse, where Evelyn's prying eyes might find it. He needed a place so utterly repulsive, so devoid of value, that no one, not the government, not his rivals, not his wife, would ever look twice at it. And then, in a moment of supreme, arrogant irony, he had willed that very vault to Thomas. "I leave the sum total of my disappointment," Thomas whispered to the empty cabin, the words echoing in the cold air. His father wasn't disappointed in him. He was terrified of him. Thomas was the living, breathing reminder of his original sin. He left Thomas the boat to humiliate him, assuming he would take one look at the rusted hull, call a scrapyard, and let his darkest secrets be melted down into slag. He bet everything on the assumption that his eldest son was too weak, too uninvested to look closer. He bet wrong. Thomas didn't call a scrapyard. Instead, he packed the ledger and the bonds back into the titanium box, locked it, and carried it off the Iron Albatross in the dead of night. The next morning, he didn't drive back to his high school in Boston. He drove straight to New York City, pulling up to the towering glass facade of Covington and Burling, one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms on the East Coast. He didn't want a family lawyer. He wanted a corporate assassin. He sat down with Harrison Hayes, a senior partner who looked like he ate hostile takeovers for breakfast. He placed the black leather ledger on his polished mahogany desk. "My father was Richard Gallagher," Thomas said, his voice steady. "And this book proves that his entire estate is built on stolen property." Harrison spent 4 hours sequestered in a conference room with 2 forensic accountants and the ledger. When he finally emerged, his eyes were gleaming with the predatory thrill of a lawyer who had just been handed the case of a decade. "Your father was a very careful criminal, Thomas," Harrison said, adjusting his tie. "But he made one colossal legal blunder in his final act." "The boat," Thomas said. "Exactly," Harrison nodded, tapping a thick finger on the table. "Alexander Pendleton drafted the will to give your stepmother and brother the controlling shares of the company. But they only own the company as it legally exists. This ledger proves that the foundational assets of Gallagher Freight are technically a stolen trust belonging to the estate of your mother, Margaret Callahan. As her only living descendant, you are the rightful claimant to those original assets, plus 40 years of compounding interest and punitive damages." Harrison smiled, a cold, sharp expression. "Furthermore, the will explicitly left you the physical possession of the boat and all its contents. He legally gifted you the very evidence needed to dismantle his empire. We don't just have a catastrophe falls, Thomas. We have a guillotine." 3 weeks later, the rain was once again pouring down in Boston. But this time, the atmosphere in Alexander Pendleton's office was entirely different. Thomas sat on the expensive leather sofa, but he wasn't looking at his shoes. He was watching Evelyn and Preston. Evelyn's impeccable composure had shattered. She looked pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a designer handbag in her lap. Preston was pacing the length of the room, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and panic. He wasn't checking his phone today. Alexander Pendleton looked like he had aged 10 years. He sat behind his desk, flanked by Harrison Hayes and 2 federal agents from the SEC. "This is absurd," Preston finally exploded, slamming his hands on the lawyer's desk. "It's a forgery. My father built that company with his bare hands. You can't just walk in here with some old diary and claim you own 60% of my life." "It's not a diary, Preston. It's a confession," Thomas said quietly, leaning forward. "And the forensic handwriting analysis, backed by the UBS bond serial numbers, has already been verified by the federal court. The company wasn't built, it was hijacked." "Alexander, do something!" Evelyn snapped, her voice shrill. Alexander Pendleton slowly took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. "Evelyn, there is nothing I can do. The court has placed a hard freeze on all Gallagher Freight assets, offshore accounts and real estate holdings pending a full federal audit. The preliminary injunction has already passed. The estate is insolvent until the stolen funds are repatriated to Thomas." "Insolvent?" Preston choked out. "The penthouse? The Hamptons?" "Purchased with commingled stolen funds," Harrison Hayes interjected smoothly. "They will be seized and liquidated to satisfy the debt owed to my client." The silence that followed was deafening. The empire his father had built, the arrogant fortress of wealth he had used to terrorize Thomas's mother and marginalize him, was collapsing in real time. Evelyn buried her face in her hands, letting out a stifled, ragged sob. Preston stared at Thomas, his jaw slack, the realization finally dawning on him that he was no longer a billionaire golden child. He was just a man with a fraudulent resume. Thomas stood up, adjusting his coat. He didn't feel a surge of vindictive joy. He just felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The ghost of Richard Gallagher had finally been exorcised. "You're taking everything," Preston whispered, his voice cracking. "No, Preston," Thomas replied, pausing at the door. "I'm just taking back what he stole." Over the next 2 years, the legal fallout was monumental. Thomas didn't keep the company. He didn't want the corner office or the stress of running a logistics empire. Once the court finalized the transfer of assets, he sold Gallagher Freight to a rival conglomerate for a massive sum. He used a large portion of the funds to establish the Margaret Callahan Foundation, an educational charity focused on providing full-ride scholarships to underprivileged students in the Boston area. He kept his job as a high school history teacher, though he upgraded his beat-up Honda to something slightly more reliable. As for his inheritance, the Hamptons estate was sold to a tech billionaire, and the penthouse went to a foreign investor. Evelyn and Preston were left with a modest settlement, enough to live on comfortably, provided Preston actually went out and found a real job. But he kept the boat. He paid a small fortune to have the Iron Albatross towed out of the water and dry-docked in a private shipyard in Camden. He didn't restore it. He left the rust, the rotting wood, and the shattered mahogany paneling exactly as he found it. Every once in a while, on a quiet, foggy Tuesday, Thomas drives up the coast to Maine. He climbs the rusted ladder, steps into the ruined wheelhouse, and looks at the shattered vault. It serves as his personal museum, a permanent, physical reminder that the most valuable things in life aren't always wrapped in luxury, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden beneath a lifetime of rust. If Thomas's journey from being the outcast son to dismantling his father's corrupt corporate empire gave you chills, hit that like button and share this video. Family secrets always have a way of surfacing, even when they are buried under decades of rust and steel. What would you do if you inherited a billionaire's darkest confession? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next gripping story.